My name is John Lobell, and these are lectures I can give on cruise ships. The lectures I'm going to describe here are on art, and I'll talk about 5 of them, but I've been teaching history of art and architecture for many years, so I can do just about anything on history of art, art and culture, etc. So I'll begin with the art of the Western world, and I have a somewhat different approach where I look at each of the cultures of Eurasia and see what distinguishes each one, the West or Europe. There's a notion of an individual with an inner moral compass different from what we see in other cultures. We see this differentiation as each culture expresses itself in its epic poems and its temple form. So the epic poems for the West are the Arthurian romances, Tales of King Arthur, Knights of the Round Table. There's one in which they describe going on a quest. They thought it would be a disgrace to go forth in a group. So it's demanded of us that we act individually. And then temple form for Western European culture, which America inherits, is the Gothic Cathedral. And we see this soaring aspiration. You can tell the people who built these, their descendants, will be the ones who circle the globe and go out into space. We see in Western art the unfolding and development of the individual like an onion. So we start with a Cimabue on the left, Madonna and Child, and they are not fleshed out, they're in a spiritual space. And then on the right, a Leonardo Da Vinci, and we have fleshed out human beings in nature. We see developing in the Renaissance this notion of all the parts of an individual. So the famous Raphael School of Athens has scientists, poets, etc., and the painting artists. And these are all the parts of a full person. The Renaissance had been rather static, and with the Baroque we get emotional dynamism. Here in our Rubens' Assumption of the Virgin. And here at Caravaggio, the shocking moment as several of the disciples say, "Oh my God, that's him," for the resurrection of Christ, reaching out to pull us into the action of the painting. And this reaching out we see in Baroque architecture and Bernini's colonnade in front of St. Peter's, reaching out to embrace the faithful. And we see this action in Baroque sculpture on the right with Bernini, the depth of the human character in a Rembrandt compared to the simplicity of a Renaissance portrait, and then the frivolity that comes with the Rococo. And then we get something new, the Romanticism and the Sublime. The Sublime says, do you think your rational science can comprehend the majesty of nature and the depths of the individual's psychology? And then as early as the late 1700s, we see a recognition of the unconscious in this Henry Fusel, The Nightmare. And then in the later 19th century, the ordinary. These are everyday working people on a Sunday brunch. And then with the modern, the anxiety of the modern world in this poor little creature in Edvard Munch's The Scream. And a home for this Western person. And here we have Palladio's Villa Rotunda, which puts the individual human being in the center, dominating the landscape. Other cultures don't see it that way. In Japan, we see in the Katsura Imperial Villa the human beings being integrated with the landscape instead of dominating it. And then we get this notion of the individual further developed. We see in Huckleberry Finn, Huck Finn, turning against social norms that say it's wrong to steal a slave, he should turn Jim in, and instead he's going to follow his inner voice. And then with Raymond Chandler in his famous essay, The Simple Art of Murder, down these mean streets a man must go. We then see that played out in terms of this Western individual person in John Wayne and Stagecoach, Matt Damon in Born Identity, Anna Jolie in Salt, and these movies that are really difficult movies, Gattaca, Truman Show, Clockwork Orange, in which there's this defiant assertion of one's individuality. And then more recently, a new individual is emerging in the long-form television drama series with a deeper realism, confronting moral ambiguity, and continuing the struggle to create a self. We'll talk about how these shows do that. So, you can see my full lecture on the art of the Western world on this website and on YouTube. I have a lecture available on the Renaissance masters, and we begin with looking at what the Renaissance is. On the left, a Greek sculpture, on the right, Michelangelo's David, and we see a rebirth of Greek humanism, but we're going to add individual psychological depth that we don't see in the Greek sculpture, and the centrality of the individual human being as they dominate the landscape, placed in the center of Palladio's Villa Rotunda, and the movement from the spiritual individual in a spiritual space in a medieval Cimabue, Madonna and Child, to Raphael's, in which they are fleshed out three-dimensional human beings in a natural landscape. We'll look at this revival of classical ideas in this birth of Venus. We have a classical goddess, Venus. And then we'll look at how these figures are placed in a three-dimensional space through perspective and are anatomically developed. We'll look at Vesalius's anatomical studies. So we'll look at Leonardo da Vinci, his Mona Lisa, his Vitruvian Man, his anatomical studies, his studies of nature. Look at these swirling energies. And then his machines, tanks, flying machines, and he did autonomous robots and a self-driving car. So that'll all be interesting. Then Michelangelo, launching his career with the Pietà, then the David, and the Sistine Chapel ceiling. We'll have fun with this image. Here we have God sending the spark of life to Adam, but look at that drapery surrounding God. And it was recently thought this could be a section of a human brain. So God is within the human imagination in this presentation. And then Michelangelo's powerful sculptural architecture at St. Peter's. And then late in his life, here's Mary again with the dead Christ, a very different presentation than we had at the beginning of his career on the right. And then finally Raphael, and we'll look at the School of Athens, in which there are all these figures from Raphael's time and from classical ancient Greece representing artists, poets, scientists, mathematicians, but they're really all parts of an individual human being represented in these different figures. That's the Renaissance masters. I have studied and taught the art and culture of the East for many years, and so I really enjoy this material. We start with, why did the West, European West, come to dominate the globe? Here we are in the early 1400s, Admiral He in China launching these giant ships, 15 times the tonnage of Columbus's ship. And he set sail around Asia, but then the emperor destroyed the ships. We'll talk about why. Very different worldview in Asia. We'll look at the worldviews of these different cultures and how they're expressed in their epic poems and their architecture. And then we'll look at Buddhism in India, Borobudur, and how it represents levels of consciousness, world of desire, the world of form, formless world, and the void. We'll contrast on the right, Michelangelo's David, the individual with an inner psychology contrasted to Prajna Paramita, goddess of transcendent wisdom in the East. This is from Indonesia. in a meditative state. And then look at how in China the earth energies of the dragon are venerated, whereas in the West every hero slays a dragon. And we'll see in the East how the architecture is integrated with nature, with geomancy. On the left is a Chinese landscape where there are people, but they're integrated with nature. We don't notice them right away. We notice the Mona Lisa. It stands out from nature. And we'll look at the Tao Te Ching, Analects of Confucius, and the Journey to the West of the Monkey King in Chinese literature and see how that presents the Chinese and broader Eastern notion of the human place in the world. Switching over to Japan, this is Ise Shrine, and we see how the wood is unfinished so that it can rot and dissolve back into nature, and every 20 years they rebuild it. And Katsura Imperial Villa integrated into its landscape, contrasting with the West, where Palladio's Villa Rotunda dominates the landscape. Look at Chinese art. Here we are from the late 12, early 1300s. Look at this beautiful portrayal of nature, these insects and frogs. And Japanese art, we'll look at that in relationship to Zen Buddhism, and then the Japanese garden integrated with nature. We almost don't notice these boats in the wave, which is actually supposed to be a view of Mount Fuji, which we see in the background. And then we'll look at the influence of the East on the West. And here is Mary Cassatt on the right, very influenced by this Japanese approach. And we'll talk about in the East a notion of we're not supposed to try to improve nature, whereas in the West, that's exactly what science is, taking over understanding and redoing nature. And we'll look at some shocking thoughts about that, like reprogramming the universe. There are Western scientists talking about that. But then maybe the two come together. We see the notion in Buddhism that our universe is the field of the interlocked minds of all beings. And then the physicist James Jeans saying, the universe begins to look more like a great thought than a great machine. So you can see my full lecture on the art and culture of the East on this website and on YouTube. Modern art and culture, and I say and culture because I want to sort of look at what is it that changes with the 20th century that brings about this modern art. Looking back, we have Newtonian uniform space and time, notion of the universe as a great machine, and our perspective painting had put us into this uniform universe, and we can see culture as a stage. These arts set out the stage on which we're going to live out our lives, and that stage is becoming very slippery and unpredictable with the 20th century. So with the 20th century, we get a loss of all fixed frames of reference. The universe had been just the Milky Way on the left. Starting in the 1920s, there's billions and billions of galaxies. Science gave us relativity, in which space is in flux, and quantum theory, in which case the particle's not anywhere until we look at it. It's our looking at it that fixes it. Chaos theory, that shows us that the slightest variation can cause huge differences. Society totally changes with World War I and the collapse of the Victorian sense of human perfectibility. The European empires collapsed, and we have the emergence of nationalism. In society, we have a decline in the influence of religion and a rise in the influence of science. We have the breakdown of aristocracy and the rise of entrepreneurship. Here's Henry Ford's assembly line. How do we orient ourselves in this new emerging world? And to see that, let's look at the arts. In literature, in Ulysses, we have the self-referential, internalized archetypes what had been outside and fixed in the world now becomes in flux inside each of us. We go from the classical Beaux-Arts arts we see on the left to modern art. We can see here in Monet that the cathedral dissolves. There's only the light coming from it. We're not even sure there's a cathedral there behind the light. And then with Van Gogh, we have each star becomes a swirling knot of energy rather than an object. And then we have a shattering of our confidence in humanism with Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon of 1907, and then later his Cubism, putting the viewer and the viewed in motion as though we are seeing the world in a shattered mirror. Matisse, again, no fixed references. And then Surrealism to Chirico here, the world is mystery, dream, nightmare, mystery. And of course, Surrealism brings us Dali's Melting Watches. And then we'll end with Jackson Pollock, and then we'll realize something is going to change. Whoa! That's for another lecture. So that's modern art and culture. I do a lecture on the art and culture of the 1960s. We can say that in 1907 with Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, Pablo Picasso launched the 20th century, but then just 10 years later with his urinal called The Fountain, Marcel Duchamp in 1917, I say, launches the 21st century early. And so Duchamp we associate with Nude Descending a Staircase of 1912, and that's within the traditions of the time. It's sort of like a bit of Cubism, a bit of Futurism, Italian Futurism. But then he does The Fountain and totally changes our concept of what art is. We don't describe this thing aesthetically, but rather its impact on us. And the idea that the work of art is not an object of beauty in itself, but evokes something in us, becomes the underlying theme of the art of the 1960s. So here's another Duchamp, a snow shovel. Sometimes you'll find it hanging in the Museum of Modern Art. He didn't make this. He goes out to the hardware store and buys it. So, 1960s culture. It's a time of new age, rock music, flower children, and we get Andy Warhol, his soup cans, his celebrities, and then we get other pop artists. Here's Roy Lichtenstein, adopting his style from the comic books of the day, the romance comics. Claes Oldenburg, one of my favorites, making giant versions of everyday objects. Here's a toothpaste tube. Here's a typewriter eraser, if anybody remembers what that is. And a series of drawings. Here's one proposing a giant concrete block set on Canal Street and Broadway. Sort of evokes the traffic of New York. I always feel like, why isn't it moving? This is something I did, environmental sculpture encompassing the entire room. This is something I curated, James Lee Byers at the Architectural League, a series of communal garments. This is the Pink Silk Airplane. And you come to the gallery and there are head holds in here. You get in there. You imagine you're flying. This is another show that I curated. Not really a show. It existed in the phone wires. So we had leading poets of the day recording their poetry on these answering machines, and then people from all over the world called in and could hear this poetry. And then later art gets really interesting. We'll talk a little bit about what this is about. Damien Hirst, the Sensations show that originated in England, traveled to the Brooklyn Museum in New York. Very shocking stuff. And this is all inspired by this Marcel Duchamp urinal and the 60s art. And we'll end with Jeff Koons' balloon dog. That's stainless steel. Really tricky in making that. I'm involved with fabricating for major sculptors, so I know how difficult that thing was. Again, I think we might say that Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon of 1907 launched the 20th century, and just 10 years later, Marcel Duchamp's Fountain launched the 21st century. You can see my full lecture on the art and culture of the 60s on this website and on YouTube.